research is actually, I mean, if I had to find something that contains the, the sort of the guiding thread through what I've worked on, it's something that could be called identity, but isn't really what people usually indicate by identity. It's more, I mean, I think selfhood would be a more useful category of thinking about the material that I've published. So the first book, many, many years ago, a dozen years ago, was about theatricality and identity in literature. And then a few years later, I decided that I wanted to work on what happens when collective identities meet each other, what happens at the encounter or the interface between two collective identities. And there, that's what became eventually my book on the translations of the Qur'an during the Enlightenment, which is called, not surprisingly, the Enlightenment Qur'an. My focus really in this book was on how the Qur'an was translated and read in early modern Europe. This is a period that hasn't really, it's been studied from a variety of angles, but the question of early modern Orientalism, or rather early modern understanding of the Arab world and Islam and so on, is just sort of beginning to open up. And I think there's still a long way to go in terms of understanding who did what and what their sources were and what they were thinking and so on and so forth. So what I did is I focused on the two best known translations from this period, which is to say a Latin translation of the Qur'an by a man named Ludovico Marracci, who was working in Rome, and an English translation by a man named George Sale, who worked in London. Marracci's translation was published in 1698. Sale's translation was published in 1734. We know, because Sale confesses to this, that he relied very heavily on Marracci's translation of the Qur'an to produce his translation of the Qur'an. But what's really fascinating about these two is that they're a wonderful example of how you can have identical data, identical information being shared between two different people, and you end up with two completely different results. So we have the Marracci translation is preceded by a very long introduction, what he called the prodromus, to the refutation of the Qur'an. He didn't really call it a translation, he called it a refutation. And his goal really was to refute the Qur'an by using either Qur'anic terms or Qur'anic structures or information gleaned from theological works. And in order to complete this project, what Marracci did was not only learn Arabic and a number of other Semitic languages, but he spent many, many years reading and compiling and collecting manuscripts from the Arab and Islamic worlds. The breadth and the scope of the information contained in this translation / refutation of the Qur'an is simply phenomenal. It's really hard to call it anything other than the first encyclopedia of the Qur'an, because it's all there. There's a great deal of information. So once the reader gets past the introduction, the prodromus, which is, by the way, very, very long, it's in several volumes, what you see on more or less every page is the text of the Qur'an in Arabic, fully vocalized, and then a translation into Latin, notes on the translation, explaining which exegetical sources, which part of the tafsir Marracci is using in order to explain a given verse, and so on. And then, and this is the really curious bit, the volume of all of that information is then dwarfed by a very lengthy refutation of every single aspect of the Qur'an. So the reader is sort of confronted with, on the one hand, a wealth of information about Islam that they would never have found anywhere else, that was never previously available to the European reader, at least not in one place, and certainly not with this degree of sophistication and intelligence and so on. And then there are these very, very long refutations. Now, of course, there were good political reasons for this, not only because Marracci himself believed in the necessity of such a refutation, but because of the ongoing wars between the Ottoman Empire and Europe. So it's not completely surprising. But what is surprising is the amount of energy that went into the one and the other simultaneously. The amount of energy that went into translating, first of all, producing a vocalized text, which is really a remarkable achievement for the period, and then translating the text, which was even more remarkable, translating it very accurately. And then, adding all sorts of annotations and information to the translation, and then finally refuting all of this and saying, well, it's incorrect because A, B, C, D, E, and so on. Despite all of this, Marachi was the translation of choice for Orientalists and Arabists well into the 19th century. So we know, for example, that Abraham Geiger, who wrote a book called What Did Muhammad Take from Islam? What did Muhammad take from Judaism? Was hat Muhammad aus dem Judentum genommen? Relied very, very heavily on Marachi for his information, and so that whole school of German Orientalists was in fact very heavily indebted, maybe not to the spirit of the refutation, but certainly to the information that Marachi made available in his translation. So that's one translation. Now, George Sale very clearly not only knew Marachi's work, but relied on it very heavily. There are those who claim that the translation of George Sale is nothing more than a retranslation out of the Latin. I don't believe that that's the case. We know that he knew Arabic. We know that he relied on the Arabic text. So I don't really buy the argument that it was simply a translation from the Latin, although the evidence is very clear. And there's been some recent research by a young historian at Princeton, Alexander Bevilacqua, that shows pretty conclusively that his debt to Marachi is extensive. But that said, the experience of reading the Sale translation of the Qur'an is nothing like reading Marachi. Not even close. It's a very lucid, very clear, very limpid approach. And if anything, it's pretty clear that Sale wants to present Islam as being something that is much more rational and much less random and violent than it had often been accused of being at that particular point in time. Part of this has to do with interconfessional polemics. George Sale says very clearly in his preface that Marachi was a Catholic, and therefore he ended up translating in a certain way. But Providence has reserved for the Protestants the glory of the Qur'an's overthrow. So even though he says Qur'an's overthrow, he doesn't really try to overthrow much of anything. He just says, this is what it is. And again, the Sale translation was so remarkable and so readable and so accessible, without necessarily compromising on the sort of the noble dignity of the language of the Qur'an, that, again, it continued to be published and republished well into the 20th century. So you can still get copies of the Sale translation today. Now, the second part of the project was seeing how all of this was received by various thinkers in the 18th century. And perhaps the most striking example here is the figure of Voltaire. Voltaire, who wrote in his youth a play called Mahomet, which many people take to be a play that is critical of Muhammad and Islam, and it certainly doesn't pull any punches in that regard. But really what Voltaire was arguing against was the power of the Pope. So Mahomet in this play, the figure of Muhammad, is really the Pope. But still, it was a very risky maneuver. I mean, it's, as Voltaire knew better than anybody, there was no guarantee that anybody reading this play or watching this play being performed would say, aha, I can see now that this is that Voltaire is thinking about the Pope. And so, shortly after his exile and his trips to England, he understood that there's some interesting work being done, and eventually, a couple of years after the publication of the Sale translation in 1734, he got a copy, and we are very fortunate in having the annotations that Voltaire made to his copy of the Sale translation. So we actually know which parts of the Sale translation which parts of the translated Qur'an he found useful, which parts of the translated Qur'an in a way struck him as being remarkable, and so on and so forth. And so eventually, when we see the stuff that he wrote later in life, I'm thinking in particular of the Essai sur les mœurs, the universal history, Muhammad is actually presented in a much more positive light. Now, of course, again, this has to be contextualized. He does say that Muhammad was a great man, but of course, wise minds will always prefer the figure of Confucius, who was even wiser than Muhammad. But the point is that it's a very interesting trajectory going from simply using Muhammad as a kind of figure, a mask for fanaticism, and talking about the Pope's fanaticism, to really thinking about Muhammad as one of these great men of history who took a simple tribe and turned it into a great empire, which is very much the same discourse that we find in the Sale translation of the Quran. So I explored a few other readings of the Sale Quran. I also end the Enlightenment Qur'an with a chapter on Goethe, who was, again, very interested in the cultures of Islam and who tried, with it must be said, mixed results to learn some of the languages of the Middle East, and who found in them a kind of source of inspiration for the creative project, for how to think about literature and how to think about what literature can do in the world. And a big part of that, of course, has to do with his engagement with the German translations of the Quran. There was a great debate in Germany, not necessarily a debate, but actually more of a kind of a translation arms race, because there was this belief that there desperately had to be a good German translation of the Quran produced by a German scholar of Islam to in a way compete with the translations that were coming out from Marachi and from Sale. And eventually, I mean, it's hard to say exactly what Goethe wanted from an ideal translation of the Quran. We know that he wrote a very brief. He left a brief fragment, something called the Mahomet Gezang, the song of Muhammad, the chant of Muhammad. And so, really, for him, Muhammad was a kind of poetic and prophetic genius, and the translation of the Quran had to do justice to this combination of poetry and prophecy, which is an extremely high standard. I mean, it's not something that just anybody can do. They would not only have to accurately render the Quran, but they would also have to write it in a wonderfully poetic, creative idiom that's really not every translator can produce. So that's where that particular project ends. And I end it in the late 18th and early 19th century, partially because the history of Islamic and Middle Eastern and more generally Oriental studies in the 19th century is really far too big and far too complex to be contained in sort of an additional chapter. It really would take several more books to get a grip on that. So I just said this might be a good place to stop for this project. And then after that, I moved on to another one of my favorite sort of areas of inquiry, which is contemporary Arabic literature. And here, the question that I asked myself was, there seemed to be a very strange pattern emerging in the 1970s and 1980s, and specifically in Arabic fiction. So, traditionally, people associated Sufism with poetry. The reason is, quite simply, because there's a large body of Sufi poetry, of mystical poetry. I'm thinking not only of people like Rumi, for example, or Hallaj, but any number. I mean, across the centuries, there's been a very strong relationship between Sufism and poetry. The curious thing in the sort of starting in the 1970s is that we see a lot of novelists turning to Sufism not only as a source of local color, say. You know, for example, you write a story about a town or a village, and inevitably there's going to be a Sufi character. This is something that's been there from the beginnings of Arabic fiction in the early 20th century, so that's not quite a terribly interesting line of inquiry. What is interesting, what I found interesting, was that there were these novelists who were using Sufi ideas and Sufi vocabularies to write their novels. They were working them directly into the fabric of the novel. And the question really became, why? Why is this happening now? Why is this phenomenon so widespread? And, moreover, if you have a novelist and you assume that this novelist has the option of writing in any style, in any, they have a whole palette of tools of composition at their disposal, why write like a Sufi? Why use the language of the Sufis to narrate what would otherwise be a realist novel? So, for example, if you look at Naguib Mahfouz is usually described as the master of realism. I think it's a very restrictive designation because, of course, his realist period really it only stretches over a couple of decades. But he lived from 1911 to 2006, and not everything that he wrote was particularly realist. If we look at the stuff that he wrote starting in the late 1970s, around 1975, 1977, we find short stories, short texts, long episodic novels, and so on, where Sufi citations are written directly into the text. And the question becomes, why does he do that? Is he just having fun, or is there a stronger reason for it? Similarly, in the 1980s, Gamal Ghatani, who was for many years considered sort of Naguib Mahfouz's second in command, and then after the death of Mahfouz became as it were, became the novelist, wrote what could be described as a combined biography and autobiography. So it's a biography of his father and an autobiography of his own life, in fictional form, of course, but the markers are very clearly there. I mean, he refers to himself as Gamal Ghatani. But the writing, the style in which this book is written, is a calque on the language of Ibn Arabi, the great Sufi master, Ibn Arabi. And the question again is, why? Given the choice of undertaking such a heavy Proustian project, why use Ibn Arabi? What good does that do, really? Given the very rich abilities and competence of Gamal Ghatani, why would he choose to do this in this particular way? Why write the story of his father's life and his own life by relying on Ibn Arabi? Now, there are a number of possibilities. Yes, the Sufis are interesting people, and Sufi ideas are endlessly fascinating. But I think what's going on in both of these texts, and in many others that I explore in this book, is that Sufism becomes, in a way, good to think with. I'm thinking here of the formula of Lévi-Strauss, bonne à penser. So, Sufism is bonne à penser. In what way? Insofar as it allows the novelists in question to reflect on the creative act, while at the same time thinking about the sorts of social and political forces that oblige them to write in a certain way. So, for example, to take the case of Gamal Ghatani, we have an account of Egypt in the 20th century, which is to say Egypt during the lifetime of his father. We have the imperial period, we have the period of independence from 1952 onwards, we have Gamal Abdel Nasser's policies, which were initially liberatory, and then eventually for many, including Gamal Ghatani, became very oppressive, and so on. And one could go on and on and on about this endless sort of historical turmoil. And the question then becomes, what does the novelist's self, what does the novelist's creative self do in order to deal with all this? And one way is to think about the language of the Sufis as a model for literary language. In fact, Ghatani at one point says, language is one of the heroes of my book, of Kitab al-Tajalliyat. Language in the sense that literary language is always pushing the limits of signification and of experience in a way that the novelist himself is being pushed against the limits of language, of expression, of signification, and so on and so forth. So in this study, I look at a number of novelists. I start with Naguib Mahfouz, and I go all the way to the Algerian novelist Tahir Wattar, who wrote two wonderful novels about the Algerian Civil War. I think the novel Al-Wali al-Tahir, which could be translated as Saint Tahir or the Pure Saint, depending on which way you want to read the title, is really a marvelous exploration of the nightmare of history in Algeria in the 1990s. And again, we have the novelist's self being pushed against events that that beggar description, let alone narration. And one way of thinking about them, and of thinking about them in the context of the history of Algeria, of the cultural memory of Algeria, not only during the imperial period, and not only during the War of Independence, but afterwards as well, leading all the way up to the Civil War, becomes, through this figure of the saint who is constantly going around and round his maqam, his site, his shrine, and who can never quite enter it, precisely because he can never possess his own history. And therefore this saint becomes, in a way, a figure for Algeria, trying to come to grips with its own history, but never quite managing to do so. So I think with Tahir Wattar, we leave the linguistic register somewhat, not completely, towards the register of character. But again, it's a remarkable experiment in fiction, and it really shows just how wonderfully inventive and endlessly thought-provoking Arabic fiction has become at the end of the 20th century. I now embarked on a new project, in a way extending the Sufi question, but here I'm trying to look at Sufism in the West. Now, there's been a great deal of writing about Sufism in the West, some of it in the academic register, some of it in the kind of new agey, anything goes register, and so on, both of which are fine. But what I'm interested in really is how certain philosophers, certain thinkers, certain writers have turned to Sufism, again, because it's good to think with. So, for example, if we look at Massignon, who was, of course, probably the most important student of Sufism in France in the 20th century, and we look at his monumental biography of Al-Hallaj. One of the most curious things about this biography is the preface where he talks about his debt to Huysmans, the novelist Huysmans, who was a very good friend of his father's and whom he met and with whom he had a very good relationship. But the question then becomes, what does Sufi biography, La Passion de Hallaj, and the legacy of late 19th century French fiction, what do they have to do to each other? What do they have to say to each other? In what way does thinking about fiction inform thinking about Sufism and vice versa? There's been a very important study in this regard, published by Lyon, who teaches in the Institut Catholique in Paris. But I think there's still sort of other questions that one could ask in the orbit of what the work that she has done that really lays the groundwork for a new understanding of Massignon. And then picking up from Massignon, of course, one of the most sort of interesting readings of Massignon is the reading that Jacques Derrida performs in his seminar on hospitality. We have bits and pieces of that seminar, part of which was published in a book called De l'Hospitalité, and then another part of which was published in a book called Acts of Religion, which was edited by Gill and Jar. And one of the questions that sort of is being asked consistently in this book, and in the seminar, I think, is what are the limits of hospitality? When does friendship turn to enmity, and so on and so forth? So one question I'm asking is simply, what does Sufism allow Derrida to do? And really, it is remarkable how, if you look at the papers in the archive, in the Derrida archive at the IMEC, you find that this whole seminar is conceived theoretically around two people, Levinas and Massignon. And it really is about ethics under the Levinas rubric and Sufism and hospitality under the Massignon rubric. And how do those two things interact with each other? There's another component of Derrida's immense oeuvre that's worth exploring, and I'm hoping to explore it in this book, and that is his relationship with Izutsu. Izutsu was Japan's foremost Islamologist and student of Arabic in the 20th century. He wrote a magnificent number of books, of which Sufism and Taoism is probably the closest one to my interests. But what's really interesting is that Derrida made a trip to Japan, where he met Izutsu, and after his return, he wrote a text that was then published under the title Letter to a Japanese Friend. Now, this title is a calque on a text by Heidegger. The English translation is The Discourse on Language, but I think it's just called Letter to a Japanese Friend. And what's interesting about this text, which is very short and very focused, is that it's one of the few occasions where Derrida really comes out and says, what is deconstruction? And so the question that has to be asked is, why is it that a discussion with a specialist of Sufism opens up the possibility of talking about deconstruction? Would it have been easier or not had he been talking to somebody else, somebody who does not work on Sufism, for example? I'll just give one third example of how Sufism works in the West. The work of Salman Rushdie, of course, is very well known, and he's been widely published, widely criticized, and he's suffered from the fatwa and its consequences. But one of my favorite books by Salman Rushdie is the book that he wrote for his son immediately after the fatwa and immediately after he went into hiding, Harun and the Sea of Stories. It's a wonderful, very moving meditation on narration, on storytelling, on literature, on the production of literature. And of course, it's really a revision of Attar's Conference of the Birds. And so the question that has to be asked is, why does Salman Rushdie returned to Sufism, as it were. His very first novel, Grimus, is an anagram of Simorg, which is, of course, sort of the point of arrival of the birds in the Conference of the Birds. And so it seems that every time that Salman Rushdie wants to, as it were, turn the keys of the narrative engine to rev things up, he always returns to Sufism, and he returns to Al-Attar in particular. So I think, again, just as we asked for Massignon, what does fiction have to say to Sufi biography? What does Sufi biography have to say to fiction? One question we could ask here is, what does Sufism have to say to the writing of the novel, the post-colonial novel, in the late 20th century? So I'm hoping to be done with this fairly soon, and I'm hoping that the readers will like it.